When the war ended, Japan was a graveyard of silence. Cities burned, soldiers surrendered, and an empire built on honor lay in ruins. But far to the north, beyond the great plains of Manchuria, there was a different kind of silence, one that spoke not of defeat, but of something deliberately erased. In the years that followed, villagers near the city of Harbin told stories. They spoke of trains that arrived at night, filled with people who never came back. They remembered soldiers in white coats, guarded compounds, the smell of chemicals on the wind, and when the Japanese army withdrew, they said the soldiers burned everything, the buildings, the records, even the trees. Then they vanished. At first, no one believed them. The Soviet troops who entered Manchuria in 1945 found only charred remains, concrete foundations, melted glass, and twisted metal. The snow covered the rest. But beneath the ashes were fragments, vials, bones, and tools too precise for a farm, too cruel for a hospital. For years, the world thought it was just another rumor from the chaos of war. But then, as the post-war tribunals began, whispers reached the Allies about a secret Japanese program, one so horrifying that even the victors hesitated to expose it. They called it Unit 731. Officially, it never existed. On paper, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Quantum Army. In reality, it was a human experimentation facility, a factory of death disguised as science. The unit was created in the early 1930s under the command of a physician named Shiro Ishii, a brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless man. Ishii was fascinated by bacteriology and obsessed with the idea that disease could be weaponized. To him, microbes were bullets, and the human body was a battlefield waiting to be mapped. He promised the Imperial Army that Japan could win wars not with bombs, but with biology. Germs would do what armies could not: kill invisibly, efficiently, and cheaply. The generals listened, funding flowed, land was seized near Pingfang, outside Harbin. A walled city rose in secret: laboratories, barracks, crematoria, and cages. By 1939, Unit 731 was fully operational. Thousands of doctors, researchers, and soldiers worked there, guarded by barbed wire and secrecy. The local population called it the Devil's Compound. Inside, prisoners were brought from across China, Korea, Mongolia, and the Soviet border. Anyone deemed an enemy of the empire. They were peasants, partisans, soldiers, even women and children. The staff never called them by name. They were Maruta, locks, locks for the furnace of progress. No one outside the walls knew what happened inside, but those who worked there carried the memories all their lives. Some spoke decades later, their voices trembling with guilt. They said that every morning began the same: the sound of boots on concrete, the hiss of disinfectant, the metallic rattle of trays. The prisoners were led from their cells to the laboratories, some for infection tests, some for frostbite experiments, some simply because the day's schedule required a body. To the men in white coats, it was data. To the world that would one day learn of it, it was horror beyond measure. Yet during the war, the existence of Unit 731 was known only to a handful of top officials. The Japanese public had no idea. The soldiers stationed nearby were told it was a water purification center. Even within the army, rumors were discouraged with threats of execution. Ishii's operation grew larger with each year of conquest. Branch facilities appeared in occupied China: Unit 100, Unit 1644, and others. But 731 remained the core. the beating heart of a nightmare disguised as medicine. When Japan invaded China fully in 1937, Ishii saw his opportunity. He had a continent of test subjects. The program expanded from laboratory experiments to field tests. Fleas infected with plague were dropped over villages. Wells were poisoned with cholera. Prisoners were deliberately infected with anthrax, typhus, and smallpox to observe the stages of decay. Everything was measured, photographed, and recorded. The data filled thousands of notebooks, the only thing more valuable to Ishii than life itself. By 1942, Unit 731 had become a secret empire within the empire. Its trains had priority clearance. Its budget was limitless. Even the emperor was briefed on its progress. Ishii was promoted, decorated, and untouchable. He believed he was creating the future of warfare, an invisible weapon that could end nations without firing a shot. But in the frozen halls of his laboratories, he was ending something else, the boundary between human and monster. As Japan's fortunes turned, the work only intensified. When Allied bombers neared the homeland, Ishii ordered his staff to destroy every trace of their research. In August 1945, as the Soviet army advanced on Manchuria, the compound was evacuated. The prisoners were executed, the buildings blown apart. What could not be burned was buried. What could not be buried was left for the snow. When the Soviets arrived days later, they found a ghost city. The ground was still warm from fire. In the ruins, they uncovered glass containers labeled with strange markings, surgical tables, and fragments of human remains. Photographs were taken, but before any global inquiry could begin, the Cold War was already drawing lines between allies and enemies. The truth of Unit 731 slipped into the fog of politics. In Tokyo, Ishii vanished. Many of his staff blended back into civilian life. Some became professors, surgeons, or government advisors. The empire had fallen, but its doctors survived. The world turned its attention to rebuilding, to occupation, to new wars brewing in Korea and beyond. For a time, it was easier not to look back, but beneath that silence, evidence remained. Not in the ruins of Pingfang, but in the stories of those who had seen, heard, or endured. They remembered the trains at night. They remembered the smoke that never stopped. They remembered that no one who entered ever came out. And somewhere in the archives of nations that swore to expose all war crimes, files marked top secret began to accumulate. Because what Unit 731 discovered, the data carved from human suffering, was too valuable to destroy. In the aftermath of defeat, when the world demanded justice, some men asked another question. Could this knowledge be used? Before Unit 731 became a fortress of death, it began as an idea. One man's vision of limitless science in service of empire. That man was Shiro Ishii. Born in 1892, Ishii grew up in rural Japan, the son of a sake brewer. He was intelligent, ambitious, and fascinated by the hidden world, microbes, diseases, and the way unseen life could control the fate of nations. At Kyoto Imperial University, he studied medicine and bacteriology. His professors describe him as brilliant but arrogant, more interested in power than ethics. When he joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a medical officer, he quickly realized that in war, knowledge was a weapon, and he wanted to be its master. By the late 1920s, Ishii had convinced himself that biological warfare was the key to Japan's future. He studied reports of Western experiments, the use of gas in World War I, the attempts to weaponize bacteria in secret Allied labs. He came to believe that Japan, surrounded by rivals and starved of resources, could only survive if it mastered invisible weapons. In 1931, the invasion of Manchuria gave him the opportunity he needed. The newly conquered territory became a laboratory, vast, isolated, and outside the eyes of international law. Ishii proposed to the Kwantung army that he could develop biological weapons capable of destroying entire enemy populations. All he needed, he said, was permission, funding, and test subjects. The generals agreed. They gave him everything. Within months, Ishii built a small research unit near Harbin, the beginning of what would grow into Unit 731. At first, the work focused on water purification and disease prevention, projects that could easily hide more sinister experiments. But Ishii's ambitions soon outgrew the cover story. He wanted to know how diseases spread through the human body, how long they took to kill, and how they could be weaponized with precision. To answer those questions, he needed living bodies. Prisoners were brought in under guard. Chinese partisans, Soviet captives, political dissidents, even civilians accused of espionage. They were told nothing. Once inside, they never left. Ishii believed he was serving science, but what he truly served was obsession. He surrounded himself with young doctors and scientists, many fresh from the country's best universities. They admired him, feared him, and followed him. He told them that they were pioneers, that history would remember their work. He said that the suffering of a few would save millions. It was the oldest lie in science, that cruelty in the name of progress is justified. And so the doctors of Unit 731 began their descent. They learned to inject prisoners with bacteria, anthrax, plague, cholera, and typhus. They measured fevers, recorded symptoms, and dissected the dead. Soon they began dissecting the living. They called the operations kaibo, dissections. No anesthesia was used. The subjects were restrained on tables as the doctors worked, taking notes as life slipped away. Every heartbeat, every breath, every convulsion was data. To the young recruits, it was shocking at first. Some vomited, others froze. But Ishii told them they must harden themselves. That emotion was weakness. In time, they stopped flinching. The transformation from healer to killer was complete. The compound expanded rapidly. New laboratories were built, along with barracks, crematoria, animal pens, and a prison block. The area spanned nearly 6 square kilometers, a self-contained city of science and secrecy. It had its own power plant, its own rail line, even its own schools for staff families. At the center stood the main building, a vast brick structure where the worst experiments occurred. Behind its thick walls, Ishii's researchers pushed deeper into madness. They froze prisoners' limbs to study frostbite, then thawed them in boiling water to record the stages of decay. They exposed people to bombs packed with plague-infested fleas to test infection patterns. They injected air into arteries to cause embolisms. They vivisected pregnant women to observe fetal infection. Everything was recorded in detail: dates, times, symptoms, causes of death. The reports were written in clinical language, as if describing experiments on animals. To the staff, the prisoners had become objects, numbers on paper. It was not only cruelty, it was structure. Each experiment followed a protocol, each death justified by research goals. This was not chaos, it was bureaucracy. The horror of Unit 731 lay not only in what was done, but in how calmly it was organized. The Japanese High Command received regular updates. The Emperor himself approved Ishii's promotions. No one stopped it because everyone benefited. By 1940, Unit 731 was producing biological weapons on an industrial scale. Fleas bred in the thousands were infected with plague bacteria and packed into ceramic bombs. These were tested over Chinese villages, their effects measured in body counts. Water sources were poisoned with cholera and typhoid. Entire communities vanished. To Ishii, it was proof of concept. He believed he had created a new kind of warfare, one that could kill without fire or sound. But in truth, he had created something else entirely, the final corruption of science. The doctors under him began to rationalize their work. They said it was necessary to prepare for biological attacks by the enemy. They told themselves the prisoners were doomed anyway, that the data might save Japanese lives. Each lie built upon the last, until there was no distinction between duty and atrocity. Outside the compound, local villagers grew fearful. Animals disappeared. Foul smoke rose from chimneys at night. The few who tried to approach were shot. Those who escaped the fences and survived carried stories that no one believed. By 1942, Unit 731's reach extended across Asia. Branches appeared in Nanjing, Changchun, and even Singapore. Wherever the Imperial Army went, Ishii's students followed. He had built not just a laboratory, but a network, an invisible empire of scientists working under the banner of progress. He held lectures for officers, teaching them how bacteria could destroy cities. He demonstrated plague bombs, anthrax grenades, and poison darts. To his superiors, he was a genius. To the victims, he was a god of death. The prisoners inside the compound began to understand what awaited them. Some tried to resist, others accepted their fate in silence. The guards treated them with mechanical indifference. They were logs, to be processed. One survivor, captured as a teenager and later freed by the Soviets, recalled how new prisoners would arrive each week, men, women, even children, and how the staff never used their names. He said the hardest part was not the experiments, but the waiting, knowing that the day would come when the door would open and they would not come back. In that place, life and death became routine. The screams were muffled by concrete walls. The doctors no longer looked at faces, only at results. Some even joked about their work. Evil in its purest form rarely announces itself. It whispers in the language of normalcy. By the time Japan began losing the war, Ishii's complex had grown to house more than 3,000 staff. He had become one of the most powerful men in the empire, protected by secrecy and fear. He drank heavily, bragged about his achievements, and believed history would vindicate him. But history was closing in. In 1945, as the Soviet army swept through Manchuria, Ishii knew the end had come. He ordered all data packed into crates for transport to Japan. The remaining prisoners were executed, the bodies burned. Every structure that could burn was torched. Every record that could be destroyed was shredded or buried. The smoke rose for days, and when the last fire died, nothing remained but ashes and silence. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the empire crumbled overnight. Soldiers burned documents, officers fled their posts, and millions of civilians waited for the victors to arrive. In that chaos, Shiro Ishii vanished. The compound at Pingfang still smoked when Soviet troops reached it. They found shattered walls, broken glass, and twisted metal. In the rubble lay human bones, surgical tools, and fragments of jars that once held preserved organs. The stench lingered in the frozen air. What the Soviets uncovered shocked even hardened veterans. At first, they thought it was a simple military hospital destroyed in retreat. Then they found the incinerators, rows of them still warm, with ash that wasn't only wood. Nearby were notebooks written in Japanese, their pages filled with diagrams of human bodies, bacterial cultures, and temperature readings. It was not a hospital, it was a factory for dissecting the human soul. Soviet officers took photographs, collected samples, and sent reports to Moscow. They planned to expose the crimes to the world. But by then, the war's alliances were unraveling. The same month the Soviets entered Manchuria, American forces occupied Japan. The Cold War had already begun, and truth became another weapon. In Tokyo, US intelligence agents began hearing whispers about Ishii's research. They learned that his experiments had produced vast amounts of data on biological warfare, data that no one else possessed. As Washington scrambled to understand the new threat of Soviet power, that information suddenly became valuable. To the Americans, Japan's atrocities were a moral outrage, but to the military, they were also an opportunity. The same government that would prosecute German scientists at Nuremberg was quietly recruiting them under Operation Paperclip. And now, in Japan, they faced a similar question. If the data could save American lives in a future war, should it be buried or used? Interrogators tracked down Ishii's former staff. They found them living quietly in Tokyo, Kyoto, and Nagasaki. Professors, doctors, researchers pretending to have moved on. When questioned, most denied everything. But a few talked. They described experiments too specific to invent: frostbite tests, plague bombs, dissections. They said Ishii had ordered the destruction of evidence, but the data itself survived. American officers listened. They took notes. And then, instead of preparing indictments, they made offers. One by one, the doctors of Unit 731 were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research. The United States wanted exclusive access to Japan's biological warfare data before the Soviets could claim it. The victims, the crimes, the evidence, all were classified as top secret. In 1947, Ishii was brought to Tokyo for questioning. He arrived in civilian clothes, calm and confident. He told his interrogators that his experiments had produced valuable results that could help the US develop vaccines and defenses against biological weapons. He promised to share everything if his freedom was guaranteed. The Americans agreed. No charges were filed. No tribunal was held. The data was shipped to Fort Detrick, Maryland, home of the U.S. Biological Warfare Program. The irony was staggering. The man who had turned science into murder now became a silent collaborator in the science of the future. His victims' suffering became numbers in an American laboratory. Justice was traded for information. Meanwhile, the Soviets held their own trials. In 1949, 12 former members of Unit 731 were prosecuted in the city of Khabarovsk. The evidence was overwhelming: documents, testimony, even photographs. The defendants confessed, many describing their crimes in chilling detail. But in the West, those trials were dismissed as propaganda. The world was already too busy dividing itself to care about truth. In Japan, silence settled over the past like a blanket of ash. The government denied everything. The schools never mentioned it. The survivors were told to forget. For decades, the story of Unit 731 remained buried, whispered only by villagers near Harbin, or by aging soldiers who could no longer bear the weight of memory. Some of Ishii's proteges went on to become respected figures in post-war Japan. They taught at universities, worked in hospitals, and contributed to the nation's economic miracle. One became head of the Japanese Red Cross. Another led medical departments in prestigious universities. Their pasts were erased, their reputations rebuilt. And Ishii himself, he lived comfortably in Tokyo until his death in 1959. Never arrested, never tried. He practiced medicine, gave lectures, and received a pension from the government he had served. According to some accounts, he even consulted for the US Army during the Korean War, advising on biological defense. To the end, he believed he had done nothing wrong. He once told a colleague that history would one day recognize his genius, but the truth had not disappeared. It only slept. In the 1980s, Japanese journalists began to investigate. They found declassified American documents confirming the immunity deal. They interviewed surviving villagers from China who described the plagues that swept through their towns during the war. They unearthed fragments of laboratory equipment from the ruins at Pingfang. The stories began to align. What had been dismissed as rumor became undeniable fact. Former doctors, now old men, began to speak. Some expressed remorse, others defended their actions as necessary for the nation. One admitted that he had injected a prisoner with plague and dissected him alive. When asked if he felt guilt, he said only, "We were at war." The Japanese government issued no apology. For decades, official textbooks omitted any mention of Unit 731. Only in local exhibits and underground museums did the victims' voices find space. In Harbin, China, the site of the compound was turned into a memorial. The Unit 731 Museum. Its halls display the remnants, scalpels, test tubes, and the names of those who disappeared. Visitors walk in silence through rooms where the walls still seem to hold their screams. Photographs line the corridors, faces of prisoners, doctors, and soldiers, all trapped in a moment that refuses to fade. Each image asks the same question: how could they do this? And how could the world allow them to walk free? The answer lies in the shadows between justice and power. When nations decide that truth is inconvenient, they bury it. When science loses its soul, it becomes the perfect weapon. The files of Unit 731 remain locked in archives, some still classified after nearly 80 years. Historians estimate that more than 10,000 people were killed in the experiments and tens of thousands more in field tests across China. Yet no one was ever punished. Their names were erased, their suffering transformed into data, and the men who conducted those experiments went home to their families and slept peacefully. It is tempting to believe that such things belong to another age, that humanity has learned, but every era finds its own excuses, its own rationalizations. In the ruins of Pingfang, the warning is carved not in stone but in silence. When knowledge becomes more important than compassion, when progress outruns morality, the result is always the same. The prisoners of Unit 731 vanished, but their story did not. It survived in whispers, in photographs, in the haunted conscience of the few who remembered. It waits in the quiet halls of museums and in the classified drawers of governments. A reminder that some knowledge comes at too high a price. For decades after the war, the world refused to look too closely at what happened in the frozen fields of Manchuria. Meanwhile, the Soviets held their own trials. In 1949, 12 former members of Unit 731 were prosecuted in the city of Khabarovsk. The evidence was overwhelming: documents, testimony, even photographs. The defendants confessed, many describing their crimes in chilling detail. But in the West, those trials were dismissed as propaganda. The world was already too busy dividing itself to care about truth. In Japan, silence settled over the past like a blanket of ash. The government denied everything. The schools never mentioned it. The survivors were told to forget. For decades, the story of Unit 731 remained buried, whispered only by villagers near Harbin, or by aging soldiers who could no longer bear the weight of memory. Some of Ishii's protégés went on to become respected figures in post-war Japan. They taught at universities, worked in hospitals, and contributed to the nation's economic miracle. One became head of the Japanese Red Cross. Another led medical departments in prestigious universities. Their pasts were erased, their reputations rebuilt. And Ishii himself, he lived comfortably in Tokyo until his death in 1959. Never arrested, never tried. He practiced medicine, gave lectures, and received a pension from the government he had served. According to some accounts, he even consulted for the US Army during the Korean War, advising on biological defense. To the end, he believed he had done nothing wrong. He once told a colleague that history would one day recognize his genius, but the truth had not disappeared. It only slept. In the 1980s, Japanese journalists began to investigate. They found declassified American documents confirming the immunity deal. They interviewed surviving villagers from China who described the plagues that swept through their towns during the war. They unearthed fragments of laboratory equipment from the ruins at Pingfang. The stories began to align. What had been dismissed as rumor became undeniable fact. Former doctors, now old men, began to speak. Some expressed remorse, others defended their actions as necessary for the nation. One admitted that he had injected a prisoner with plague and dissected him alive. When asked if he felt guilt, he said only, "We were at war." The Japanese government issued no apology. For decades, official textbooks omitted any mention of Unit 731. Only in local exhibits and underground museums did the victims' voices find space. In Harbin, China, the site of the compound was turned into a memorial. The Unit 731 Museum. Its halls display the remnants, scalpels, test tubes, and the names of those who disappeared. Visitors walk in silence through rooms where the walls still seem to hold their screams. Photographs line the corridors, faces of prisoners, doctors, and soldiers, all trapped in a moment that refuses to fade. Each image asks the same question: how could they do this? And how could the world allow them to walk free? The answer lies in the shadows between justice and power. When nations decide that truth is inconvenient, they bury it. When science loses its soul, it becomes the perfect weapon. The files of Unit 731 remain locked in archives, some still classified after nearly 80 years. Historians estimate that more than 10,000 people were killed in the experiments and tens of thousands more in field tests across China. Yet no one was ever punished. Their names were erased, their suffering transformed into data. And the men who conducted those experiments went home to their families and slept peacefully. It is tempting to believe that such things belong to another age, that humanity has learned, but every era finds its own excuses, its own rationalizations. In the ruins of Pingfang, the warning is carved not in stone but in silence. When knowledge becomes more important than compassion, when progress outruns morality, the result is always the same. The prisoners of Unit 731 vanished, but their story did not. It survived in whispers, in photographs, in the haunted conscience of the few who remembered. It waits in the quiet halls of museums and in the classified drawers of governments, a reminder that some knowledge comes at too high a price. For decades after the war, the world refused to look too closely at what happened in the frozen fields of Manchuria. Or perhaps they contain something harder to explain, the moral cost of how that data was obtained. The Unit 731 Museum in Harbin stands today as both memorial and warning. Visitors walk through dim halls lined with photographs, the smiling faces of doctors, the hollow eyes of prisoners. Glass cases display surgical tools, bone fragments, and handwritten notes taken during dissections. In one room, a single spotlight shines on a steel table. Its surface is scarred, rusted, and silent. It doesn't need explanation. School children visit, often in silence. Some cry, some look away. For most, it is the first time they hear the story. Outside the museum, the grass grows wild over the foundations of what was once the compound's prison. Birds nest in the cracks of the old walls. Time, in its quiet way, has tried to reclaim the place, but the earth remembers. Across the world, a handful of scholars continue to study the recovered records. They map the spread of plagues, track the notes on frostbite, and analyze the handwritten data on body temperatures and infection rates. Much of the information, though horrific in origin, remains scientifically accurate. It has been used in medical research, vaccine development, and biological defense. Even in death, the victims of Unit 731 are still being used, their suffering turned into knowledge. That is the final cruelty, that something born of such darkness could still shape the modern world. It raises a question that science has never fully answered, whether knowledge can ever be innocent, and whether truth gained through evil can ever be clean. The men of Unit 731 believed that progress justified everything. They believed that their nation's glory was worth any price. But history teaches the same lesson again and again. The moment we decide that one life is worth less than an idea, we lose the right to call ourselves human. The silence surrounding Unit 731 lasted for half a century, but silence is fragile. Each generation uncovers what the last tried to hide. And so, the story of the lost men returns, not to condemn the past alone, but to remind the living, because the machinery of atrocity never begins with monsters. It begins with ordinary people, doctors, soldiers, bureaucrats, who convince themselves that their cruelty serves a greater good. It begins with small compromises, with obedience, with silence. By the time anyone questions it, the line has already vanished. The doctors of Unit 731 told themselves they were defending their country. They told themselves that science demanded sacrifice. But what they built was not science, it was a mirror, one that showed the face of a world that had forgotten compassion. When the victims were gone, when the fires had burned the evidence, all that remained were numbers, temperatures, durations, dosages, mortality rates, cold data extracted from warm bodies. And in that data, a hidden question. At what point does knowledge become sin? Every civilization believes it is beyond such questions. Every era believes it has learned. But somewhere in every laboratory, every war room, every secret project, the same temptation waits, the belief that purpose excuses cruelty. Unit 731 is not only a story about the past, it is a warning about the future. If you stand today in the museum at Harbin, the air is heavy with memory. There is no sound except footsteps and the hum of the lights. The guide will tell you that this was where they kept the prisoners, and this where they performed the dissections. Outside, the wind moves through the grass, carrying the faint echo of what was once silence. It is the sound of a history that refuses to stay buried. Somewhere beneath that soil lie the ashes of thousands, the men, women, and children who vanished without graves, whose names were erased, whose bodies became data. They have no monuments, no national holidays, no justice. Only the faint whisper of remembrance carried by those who still choose to look. History cannot undo what was done, but it can choose not to forget. And in that act of remembering, in speaking their names, in telling their story, there is a kind of justice that no tribunal can offer, the justice of truth. At the end of his life, Shiro Ishii reportedly told a colleague that he was not afraid of death because he had served science. He believed history would vindicate him. It never did. His name is remembered not for discovery, but for the moment when discovery lost its soul. The legacy of Unit 731 is not only in its victims or its crimes, but in the question it leaves behind. What will we do with the knowledge born of suffering? Will we use it to heal, or will we find new ways to repeat the same sin? Every time we choose efficiency over empathy, secrecy over conscience, progress over people, the shadow of Ping Fong grows longer, and the prisoners who vanished do not rest. They live on in the data that still circulates in scientific archives. They live on in the questions whispered in classrooms and memorials. They live on in the uneasy truth that humanity is capable of anything: creation, destruction, and the blindness to see them as the same. At the museum, a plaque bears a single line written in both Japanese and Chinese. It reads, "Those who do not remember will one day become what they forget." It is not a threat, it is a memory, a warning left by the ghosts of a place that was never meant to exist. And as the visitors leave, the doors close and the light fades from the steel table in the center of the room, the silence returns. But it is not the silence of forgetting. It is the silence of witness, the quiet that comes after truth has been spoken. Because in the end, the only thing louder than the crimes of Unit 731 is the echo of those who will never stop telling their story.